John Batchelor, my professionals. We're turning to Congress. The Department of Homeland Security was the one part of the funding for the budget that did not go through successfully. At the end of last year, it was held in abeyance because of the protests by some members of the Republican Party, chiefly in the House, but it also includes the Senate, for the president's executive order on immigration, having to do with if you are a family member of a child who was born in the United States sometime in the last 5 years, and you're not a felon or haven't committed crimes, you can apply for what looks to be a path to getting a driver's license. Well, that is at issue if the Republicans make it a contest. It's no longer standing as an executive order because there's been a judge to temporarily restrain. David, do the Republicans intend to one more time charge up the hill?
One more time, 3 more times, 100 more times. You know, the irony of all of this, John, is that even if you shut down, so-called shut down the Department of Homeland Security, it really doesn't shut down, but even if it runs out of money, the president's executive order without the court injunction continues because of the way this thing is funded. What they're trying to do is get the president to sign a bill that takes away the power that he says he has to, halt all of these deportations and grant work permits. Well, if he was going to do that, he wouldn't have done this whole thing in the first place. So it's a really sort of strange confrontation to set up if your whole plan wasn't to fold at the end of the day anyway.
Mr. Fund, the Republicans like to confront the president. This satisfies some need of, instead of a pillow fight, they confront the president on funding. Has it become part of the character of the Republican Party?
Well, David has written on this. Base politics explains a lot of it. There's a very angry, vocal base fueled by talk radio that insists that the Republicans fight this president. These are people who would applaud what Rudy Giuliani said in New York last week. And a lot of Republicans, they don't fear a general election. They fear a primary election challenge from the right. So therefore, there are some Republicans who will have tickets charged because they feel that they're going to be facing political consequences back home if they don't.
John, this isn't, though, at this point, this isn't the make-or-break apocalyptic moment of the Affordable Care Act in the fall of 2013. This is a minor twist to an executive order that itself now is under severe scrutiny by the courts. If I understand what's going forward, the president took steps, made an order, gave himself powers that the courts are reluctant to say he has. For example, he mandated in such a fashion that the states were going to issue driver's licenses to people who were permitted under his executive order. That burden on the states has to be reviewed by the courts and might be rejected because the president doesn't have that power. All of that is technical language. That's the decision out of Texas. But why does the Republican Party want to get involved in the third branch of government, stopping the second branch of government from going through with what the first branch of government doesn't want? Why don't they just back off, John?
I don't think Republicans in Congress are used to having courts agree with them. And I don't think they've woken up to the fact that the Supreme Court in the last 2 years has 14 times unanimously ruled against Obama constitutional grounds. I think that the courts aren't a guarantee. After all, we see what happened with Obamacare, but the courts are clearly very frustrated and increasingly irritated by the president's aggrandizement of his powers. And I think if they wait, they have a very good chance of getting much more of what they want than they expected.
Thaddeus, you served with distinction in the House of Representatives, and you saw your colleagues get worked up into what you'd have to say is pack behavior. This time, it doesn't feel like a pack. It feels like a few voices who need to be satisfied for their own sense of empowerment. Is your measure that this can be stopped, or is it too late? Is confrontation the only way out?
Well, no, John, I do think that in fairness to my former colleagues, the Republican base, as Mr. Fund has pointed out, is very upset about this issue. And they need to see their representatives vent some of that frustration. Right. But as Mr. Drucker has pointed out, the calculation is a problem for the House Republicans especially, because in your venting, if you vent and vent and vent and ultimately cave, you'll be worse off in the eyes of your base than had you actually told them the real lay of the land and proceeded in a much more sane, responsible fashion with an end goal a little further down the road.
David, the courts have issued, the federal judge has issued a temporary order. The White House has asked for a stay of the temporary order. Nothing's happened so far. This is going to go to a higher court. It will be argued about. There might be another round. Is that maneuvering room for Mr. McCarthy? What's the buzz on the Hill, David?
Look, I think this has become in some ways about more than this whole thing, even though it's about so much less in many ways. And that is, if House Republicans, without getting a clean bill passed by the Senate and sent to them, just go ahead and cave and move a clean bill, they've sent a message to Senate Democrats, the minority, that anything you can stick together and filibuster on, we're screwed, and we'll just do what you want. And that's a really bad place this early in the Congress for House Republicans to be. And so, as kind of messed up as this is for them strategically, at this point, they're better off holding their ground and telling the Senate, fine, if you can figure out a way to pass something, we're going to have to address it, and we'll deal with it then. And for Republicans that are looking at the court case, and, we're asking, well, shouldn't they then adjust? A lot of them are going to come back and say the courts are unreliable. If we fund Homeland Security through the end of the year, then we're going to lose all leverage if, 4 weeks from now, the courts basically say this can go on unabated. And that's why I don't think they're going to be persuaded by the Texas case that was ruled on by a Republican-appointed judge.
Right.
And that's where they are.
Mr. Fund, your measure of this, is the public paying attention? This doesn't have the feel of the final episode of a long-running serial the way the Affordable Care Act did.
Well, if people start getting their papers, and if there's more and more evidence that, as the Texas Governor Greg Abbott says, more and more people are crossing the border in anticipation of further liberalization, then you could get an example of like the children of last summer, where people get really upset because they see the Americans being taken advantage of.
John Fund of the National Review Online, David Drucker, the Washington Examiner, my colleague and friend and co-host Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the author of Liberty Risen. I'm John Batchelor.